Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. The person who once demanded every ounce of your attention, who thrived on your emotions, suddenly realizes you're gone. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, completely. That moment is quiet, almost invisible, yet it shakes the foundation of everything they thought they controlled. Today, we're diving into what truly happens when the narcissist realizes they've lost you, and more importantly, what it reveals about your power, your freedom, and the unshakable strength you discover when you stop bending, stop explaining, and finally come home to yourself. Stay with me. Loss doesn't register immediately for a narcissist because their emotional world is wired around stimulation, not connection. In the beginning, when you leave, they don't feel the weight of you being gone. They feel relief mixed with denial. Relief because the challenge, the accountability, the emotional depth you brought is no longer demanding anything from them. Denial because they genuinely believe you are replaceable, that someone else will step into your role and keep the dynamic alive. To them, people are interchangeable sources, not irreplaceable bonds. At first, they assume you'll come back. You always did before. Your silence is interpreted as a phase, not a boundary. And so they move on quickly, sometimes dramatically, not because they rehealed, but because distraction is their primary coping mechanism. They fill the space with noise, attention, validation, new faces, anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel what your absence actually means. But here's where time becomes important. Loss arrives for a narcissist not through emotion, but through consequence. It shows up when the new supply doesn't mirror them the way you did, when conversations feel hollow, when their charm stops landing the same way, when they realize no one else absorbed their emotional chaos with the patience you had. That's when the silence starts to echo. They don't miss you in the way you miss someone you loved. They miss the regulation you provided, the stability you offered without them earning it. The loss doesn't feel like grief. It feels like disorientation, a quiet unraveling of the illusion that they were never dependent on you. And when that realization finally comes, it doesn't break them open. It unsettles them. Because the loss isn't about you being gone, it's about the mirror going dark. And once that silence starts echoing, once the mirror goes dark, something deeper begins to happen. Your absence doesn't just leave a gap, it disrupts their sense of control. Not all at once, but in subtle, unsettling ways. Control was never about dominance in the obvious sense. It was about predictability, about knowing how you would respond, how much you would tolerate, how far they could push before pulling you back in. When you were there, they didn't need to understand you. They only needed to manage you. Your reactions, your explanations, your emotional labor, all of it gave them a rhythm to move to. Even conflict served a purpose. Anger, tears, reconciliation, it kept the bond alive and, more importantly, kept them centered. You were the emotional thermostat, constantly adjusting so they never had to feel too much or too little. But now, without you, the pattern breaks. There is no one to provoke into reassurance, no one to pull closer just to prove they still can. And that loss of control feels foreign, almost threatening. They start reaching out, testing the waters, not to reconnect emotionally, but to see if the old levers still work. A message, a memory, a carefully timed apology that sounds sincere but changes nothing. It's not about missing you, it's about restoring the dynamic. What unsettles them most is not your departure, but your steadiness. You are no longer reactive. You are no longer explaining yourself. And that lack of access makes them feel small in a way they don't have language for. Because control was how they felt safe, how they avoided facing their own instability. And so your absence becomes more than a loss. It becomes a challenge to the illusion that they were always in charge. When they realize they can no longer reach you, influence you, or predict you, the ground shifts beneath them. And that shift is the moment they begin to understand that something they once relied on is truly gone. And when that control no longer responds to their touch, when the old levers stop working, another truth starts to surface, one that's far harder for them to face. What they miss isn't you in the way a person misses a soul, a laugh, a presence that made life warmer. What they miss is the supply you provided, the steady stream of affirmation, patience, and emotional availability that kept their inner world from collapsing. This is where the confusion deepens for them. They Tell themselves they miss you. They might even believe it. But listen closely to what shows up in their words if they reach out. It's rarely curiosity about your healing, your peace, or your growth. It's about how things used to feel for them, how grounded they were, how understood they felt, how lost they are now. The focus never truly leaves their own experience. Because what you gave wasn't just love, it was regulation. You absorbed moods they didn't want to sit with. You translated chaos into calm. You made their emotional world feel manageable. And when you left, that function disappeared. The loss they feel isn't romantic, it's functional, like losing power in a house that was never wired correctly to begin with. That's why replacements never quite work. Someone new can admire them, desire them, even adore them. But they don't know the emotional terrain the way you did. They don't know how to anticipate the shifts, soften the edges, or stabilize the storms. And so the narcissist grows restless, irritated, dissatisfied, not because the new person is lacking, but because the role you played was never meant to be replaced so easily. And this is the moment the loss sharpens, not with tenderness, but with resentment. They begin to feel entitled to what you gave without understanding the cost it took from you. They don't miss your heart, they miss the access to it. And when they realize that access is permanently closed, it leaves behind a hollow space they don't know how to fill. Meanwhile, on your side of the silence, something different is happening. You're learning what it feels like to carry only your own emotions and discovering that the weight is final. Why lighter? And as that hollow space settles in for them, something else quietly rearranges itself on your side of the story. Because what they labeled as abandonment was never about you disappearing without reason. It was about you finally choosing yourself in a dynamic that demanded your self erasure. Leaving wasn't cruelty, it wasn't punishment, it wasn't a lack of love. It was self respect finally finding its voice after being muted for far too long. For a narcissist, your departure feels like betrayal because they believed access to you was guaranteed. Your patience had trained them to expect endless chances. Your empathy had convinced them that you would always understand, always stay, always bend. So when you walked away, it disrupted a belief they held without ever questioning that your role was to remain no matter the cost to you. But here's the truth they refused to sit with. You didn't leave to hurt them. You left because staying was hurting you. Every time you minimized your needs, every time you swallowed your truth to keep the peace, every time you doubted your own reality just to preserve the connection, something inside you was quietly breaking. And eventually, survival demanded a boundary. From their perspective, the story becomes simple. You abandoned them. You gave up. You changed. That narrative protects them from the deeper truth that your leaving was a response, not an attack. Because if they acknowledged that, they would have to confront how much you endured just to stay. Your self respect is what they feel as loss. Not because it was taken from them, but because it was never theirs to own. When you chose yourself, you reclaimed something the why had grown comfortable borrowing without permission, your emotional labor, your forgiveness, your capacity to absorb pain, and while they struggled to rewrite the story in a way that spares their ego, you're standing in a quieter truth. You didn't abandon anyone. You returned to yourself. And that return is the beginning of a life where love no longer requires self-sacrifice to survive. And once you return to yourself, once self-respect replaces survival, the dynamic changes in a way no argument ever could. Because you stop explaining, you stop defending, you stop reaching for words to soften the truth. And in that quiet, something powerful happens. Silence becomes the loudest message you've ever sent. For the narcissist, your silence is not peace, it's disruption. When you no longer respond, no longer correct the narrative, no longer react to provocation, they are left alone with their assumptions. The endless back and forth that once reassured them they still mattered, still had influence, still occupied space in your mind. It's gone. And that absence speaks volumes. Silence is terrifying to someone who relied on your emotional reactions to feel real. Every unanswered message, every ignored attempt to pull you back into the story, forces them to confront a truth they've avoided. They are no longer the center of your emotional world. There's no argument to win, no apology to reject, no explanation to twist, just a wall of calm they don't know how to climb. And what makes your silence so powerful is that it isn't punishment, it's clarity. You're no longer trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You're no longer auditioning for basic respect. You've learned that peace doesn't require participation in chaos. To them, your silence feels cold, even cruel. But that's only because they're used to having access to your inner world without earning it. They confuse your boundary with abandonment because they never learn the difference. Silence removes the last illusion that they still have a say in your healing. Meanwhile, on your side, silence feels different. It feels like space, like breathing room, like finally hearing your own thoughts without them being drowned out by someone else's needs. And in that stillness, you realize something profound. You didn't lose your voice. You simply stopped using it where it was never truly heard. And in that silence where you finally hear yourself again, something shifts even deeper. Because it's not just that you stopped speaking, it's that you stopped reacting. And for a narcissist, that absence of reaction is profoundly unsettling. They were accustomed to your emotions responding on cue: hurt, confusion, anger, forgiveness. Each reaction reassured them that they still mattered, that they could still move you, shape you, pull a response out of you whenever they wanted. Now, there is nothing to grab onto. Indifference is unfamiliar territory for them. Anger they understand, tears they can work with. Even distance used to come with a countdown, a sense that eventually you would return. But your calm, your neutrality, your lack of urgency, that feels like standing in a room where the lights have gone out and no switch works anymore. Without your reactions, they are left exposed. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, destabilizing one. There's no emotional feedback to guide them, no confirmation that they still have influence. And that's when discomfort turns inward. They begin to feel restless, agitated, even invisible, emotions they don't know how to process without projecting them outward. They may escalate at this point. Louder messages, sharper words, sudden kindness, anything to provoke a response, because a reaction, even a negative one, would reassure them that the connection still exists. But when nothing comes back, when you remain steady and unmoved, it forces them to face a terrifying possibility. They no longer matter in the way they once did. And that realization strips away the illusion of power. Your indifference reflects something they can't control or manipulate: your autonomy. You are no longer emotionally available to be managed, corrected, or pulled back into the cycle. On your side, this indifference isn't coldness, it's healing. It's the emotional detachment that comes after understanding. You're not numb, you're resolved. You've reached a place where their behavior no longer defines your worth or dictates your emotional weather. And that quiet strength, more than any argument or goodbye, is what truly exposes the dynamic for what it always was. And as that quiet strength settles into your bones, as indifference turns into clarity, something else begins to unsettle them even more deeply. Your healing doesn't just remove you from the dynamic, it challenges the story they've been telling themselves all along. The story where they were misunderstood, where they were the victim, where you were too sensitive, too demanding, too broken to keep up with them. When you start to heal calmly and that narrative starts to crack. Because if you are doing better without them, more grounded, more peaceful, more yourself, then the problem was never who you were. And that realization is dangerous to someone who survives by rewriting reality. Your growth becomes evidence they can't easily explain away. You're no longer angry or desperate, no longer trying to prove your pain. You're simply well. And that wellness threatens the version of events that protected their ego. They may respond by minimizing your progress, dismissing it as temporary, claiming you've changed for the worse, anything to preserve the idea that you were the issue. But beneath those defenses is discomfort, because your healing shines a light on what they avoided: accountability, reflection, responsibility. You moving forward without bitterness is especially unsettling. It removes their favorite weapon: guilt. You're not asking for closure. You're not demanding acknowledgement. You're not carrying the emotional weight for both of you anymore. And without that, they are left alone with their unfinished inner work. Your healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It shows in your boundaries, your calm, your refusal to engage in old patterns. And that quiet consistency says more than any confrontation ever could. It says you were never the chaos, you were responding to it. And while they scramble to preserve a story that keeps them comfortable, you're living a truth that keeps you free. You're no longer invested in being seen as right, only in being at peace. And that peace, steady and unbothered, becomes the most powerful contradiction to everything they claimed you were. And when at peace becomes undeniable, when your calm can no longer be dismissed as an act or a phase, something sharp rises in its place for them. Not sadness, not remorse, anger. Because anger is safer than vulnerability and far easier than regret. Regret would require them to admit that something meaningful was lost, and more importantly, that they played a role in losing it, so the anger shows up instead. It may come disguised as resentment, criticism, or sudden hostility. They might rewrite history more aggressively, painting you as cold, ungrateful, or heartless for leaving. Not because those things are true, but because anger allows them to stay armored. It keeps them from having to say the words they don't know how to hold. I failed. I hurt you. I didn't know how to love you well. For a narcissist, vulnerability feels like exposure. It feels like collapse. So when regret begins to stir, quietly, privately, it's often converted into rage. Rage at you for no longer carrying the emotional burden. Rage at the world for not filling the space you once did. Rage at themselves, redirected outward because looking inward feels intolerable. This is why apologies, if they come, often feel hollow. They're not rooted in understanding, but in discomfort. They want the tension to stop, the ache to quiet, the loss to be undone, without having to sit in the truth of it. And when that doesn't work, when you don't soften or return, the anger intensifies. Not because you did something wrong, but because you are no longer available to regulate their emotions. Meanwhile, you recognize something clearly now. Their anger is not proof that you mattered less. It's proof that something they depended on is gone, and you no longer feel responsible for soothing that reaction. You don't rush to explain. You don't absorb the blame. You understand that regret expressed as anger is still not accountability. And in that understanding, you stay grounded because you know the difference now between someone who misses you and someone who misses what you provided. And once you see that difference clearly, once you understand that what they miss is the role you played and not the person you are, something liberating happens inside you. You stop waiting for them to notice. You stop listening for the apology that finally sounds real. You stop hoping for a moment where they suddenly understand the depth of what they lost, because you realize something essential. Closure was never going to come from their awareness. For so long, you believed that if they just saw it, if they truly grasped the pain, the effort, the love you poured in, then the story could end peacefully. But that belief kept you tethered to their perception of you. It made your healing conditional on their recognition. And that was the final thread that needed to be released. Closure doesn't arrive when they admit fault. It arrives when you stop needing them to. When you accept that some people are not capable of meeting you in truth, no matter how clearly you speak it. You understand that waiting for their realization only delays your own freedom. This is where your power quietly returns. Not in confrontation, not in vindication, but in choice. You choose not to reopen doors that cost you your peace. You choose not to explain your boundaries to people who benefited from you having none. You choose to let the story end without their agreement. And that choice is profound because it shifts the focus from what they feel to what you need. You stop measuring your healing by whether they regret losing you and start measuring it by how safe you feel in your own life, how steady your days are, how much lighter your heart feels without constant emotional negotiation. Their realization, if it ever fully comes, is no longer relevant. You're not watching from the sidelines, you're living forward. And in that forward motion, you find something far more valuable than validation, peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's understanding. And as you step fully into that forward motion, fully into your own life, the final truth becomes undeniable. When the narcissist realizes they lost you, it's not just their discomfort or regret that marks the moment. It's the fact that you have already found yourself. You are no longer waiting for their acknowledgement, no longer seeking permission to exist fully, no longer bending to accommodate a narrative that never served you. You've reclaimed your story, your emotions, your power. This is why their realization, though it may feel dramatic or intimidating from the outside, has little impact on your life. By the time they notice the absence is already irrelevant. You've built a life where your choices, your peace, and your joy are independent of their presence. You've learned to listen to your own heart, trust your own instincts, and honor your own boundaries. The space they left behind is no longer a void to be feared. It's a space that belongs entirely to you, filled with your freedom and self respect. And the irony, the subtle beauty of it, is that their loss becomes a reflection of your gain. They scramble to regain influence, to rewrite what was lost, to feel the familiar pull of control. And you don't respond. You don't have to. You've already arrived at the place they could never take you, a place where your worth is not dictated by their recognition or their validation. The ultimate lesson is this: the greatest consequence of losing you is that they never get that version of you again. And the greatest victory in leaving is that you've never been more whole, more alive, more yourself. By the time they realize the magnitude of what they've lost, you've already reclaimed your life, your power, and your peace. And nothing they do can ever undo that. You are free. You are complete. You are unshakable. And so, what we've walked through today isn't just a story about leaving someone who never truly saw you. It's a story about remembering who you are when the world tried to convince you otherwise. It's about the quiet, unshakable power that comes from choosing yourself over approval, freedom over control, and peace over chaos. Every step of that journey matters because it shows that leaving is not weakness and silence is not absence. They are acts of courage, clarity, and self respect. Think about it. When the narcissist realizes they've lost you, it's not just a moment of their reckoning, it's a testament to your growth. It's proof that the love, patience, and energy you gave were real, and that the lessons you've learned are permanent. And while they scramble to rewrite their story, to feel the familiar control they've always relied on, you are writing a story of your own, one where you are the hero, the witness, and the architect of your peace. That is a story worth living, worth feeling deeply, and worth protecting with every choice you make. So I want you to take this to heart. The greatest power in leaving someone who could never truly meet you lies not in their regret, not in their realization, not in their attempts to pull you back. It lies in your awakening. It lies in knowing that you don't need their validation, that your worth has never depended on their acknowledgement, and that your life now belongs to you and only you. Stay with me here, because this is the part that changes everything. When they realize they've lost you, it is no longer your story they are living. It is yours. And the freedom, peace, and love you now carry can never be taken away. Hold that, feel that, live that, and let it guide you to a life where you are whole, unshakable, and unstoppable.